Today we are going to do the notes for lesson 2-3, which is in your book on page 93. Lesson 2.2-3 relate to fractions, decimals, and percents. I can relate fractions, decimals, and percents by using place value reasoning and understanding a percent as a ratio that compares to a number 100. Explore percents and ratios. You will use a 10 by 10 grid to understand the relationship between percents and ratios. Relate percents to ratios and decimals. By definition, a percent is a ratio that compares a number to 100. It's a good idea to circle that. The percent 35 compares 35 to 100 as a ratio of 35 to 100. In fraction form, this ratio is 35 over 100, which means 35 hundredths. You can use the definition of percent equivalent ratios and place value reasoning to write percents as both fractions and decimals. Write 35% as a fraction. So 35% would be 35 over 100. Both of these are percents. They equal the same. This is a percent, here is a fraction. That equals the percent. And then you could take and simplify it to 7/20. You would divide both of these, numerator and denominator, by 5 to come up with 7 over 20. As a fraction, 35% is the same as 35 over 100 or 7 over 20. Write 35% as a decimal. So up here we wrote it as a percent, wrote it the percent as a fraction. Down here we will write it as a decimal. So we would take 35%, put it as a fraction, 35 over 100, but also we would take and put two numbers to the right of the decimal point to create a decimal, which is 35 hundredths. So 35% as a decimal would be 0.35 or 35 hundredths. To the right, talk about it. You can write 35 over 100 or 7 over 20, 7/20ths, or 35 hundredths to represent the fraction of 35%. What are there different ways to write the decimal form of 35%? So we would think about this and we would say, okay, 35% equals 35 hundredths or 7/20ths. To create a fractional form, we did that, 35 over 100, 7 over 20. To create a decimal form, we would need to use the number 35 over 100 because we know that with decimals we need to have a 10 as a denominator or 100 or 1,000, anything that is a multiple of 10. So in this case, we would say this equals 0.35 or 35 hundredths. It's the same as 35 hundredths. We need to make sure that we put the last number in the same spot as what we have for the name for the denominator, hundredths. So the second spot to the right of the decimal would be considered hundredths. Going on to page 94. At the top of 94, it says example 1, write percents as fractions and decimals. In a recent survey, about 95% of smartphone users claim to send text messages. write a fraction of smartphone users is this? Or what fraction? Sorry about that. What fraction of smartphone users is this? What decimal is this? So we would say part A would be right 95% as a fraction. So we would take the 95 and put it as the numerator over the 100, which would be the denominator to create a percent. We would also then, you could simplify it and make an equivalent ratio. So 95 hundredths is the same as 19 hundredths. Part B says write 95 as a decimal. So again, we're starting the same way. 95% is the same as 95 hundredths. And then we would take this and we would take a look at what the numerator is, and we would put two numbers to the right of the decimal. 95 over 100 means 95 hundredths. So 95 hundredths in the fraction form is the same as 95 hundredths. So about how many of smartphone users claim to send text messages? And we could say it two ways. We could say about 19 twentieths or 95 hundredths of smartphone users claim to send text messages. So we could use both the fractional part and the decimal part to show the percentage. Think about it. What is the first step to writing a percent as a fraction? The best thing to do is to write it. So write the percent as a rate per 100. The best thing to think about, ladies and gents, would be to, here's per 100, and then up here would be the number that would be the percent. In a recent survey, 22% of email users claim to spend less time using email because of spam. What fraction of email users is this? What decimal is this? So they're asking for what fraction of 22 is a 22% and what decimal is 22%. So if we're taking a look at this, 22% would be putting it over 100. So 22% is the same as 22 over 100, or we could do some simplifying and we could say 11 over 50, because each of these would have a common, we could divide by 2 for each of these to create a simplified fraction. 22% as a decimal, we would start it off creating the fraction over 100, 22 over 100, and then we could take and look at the second number. It's per 100. So the second number needs to be in the hundredths position, and we can use the numerator 22 hundredths. Continuing on. Bottom of page 94. Learn. Relate fractions to percents and decimals. You can also write fractions as percents and decimals. Suppose you are given the fraction 3/20. Use your understanding of equivalent ratios, the definition of percent, and place value reasoning to write 3/20 as a percent and as a fraction. So we're looking to use this as we find the equivalent ratio, then we use it to find a percent, and then place value reasoning for the decimal. So write 3/20 as a percent. So what we would need to do is we would take 3/20ths and we would multiply both by 5 because we want the 20ths to become a denominator of 100 because a percent is per 100. So find an equivalent ratio with 100 as the denominator because 20 times 5 equals 100. Then you do the same thing to the numerator. We're finding the equivalent ratio and equivalent fraction. So we would come with 3/20ths would equal 15 over 100 or 1500ths. And with that, we could take and say the numerator would show us what the percent is. So the percent would be 15% because it's per 100. As a percent, 3/20ths equals 15/100ths. Continue on to the next page, which is page 95. At the top of 95, we're going to continue the 3/20ths and we are going to write it as a decimal. We're going to continue at the top of page 95 to write 3/20ths as a decimal. So 3/20ths, again, we do the same procedure. We take the 20ths and we multiply it by 5 to put 100 as a denominator. Multiply the numerator by 5 to make it 15 because it's 15 per 100. So you find your equivalent ratio with 100 as a denominator because 20 times 5 is 100. You multiply 3 times 5 to find 15. So in this case, we would have 15 over 100, which is 1500ths, and we would reason that the second number here needs to be in the place value of hundredths. So we would say 1500ths, 0.15. So as a decimal, 3/20ths would equal 0.15. Consider the fraction 9/15ths. How can you write this fraction as a percent? Knowing there is no whole number by which you can multiply 15 to obtain 100. So let's think about that. What can we do? Well, we could do this. You can watch it animation online. We will get to that in class. So the animation shows that you can simplify the fraction first and then find the equivalent ratio with a denomination of 100. To simplify a fraction, divide both numerator and denominator by the same number. By simplifying a fraction, you can find an equivalent ratio. In this case, find an equivalent ratio with a denominator that is a factor of 100. So what we're doing is we're taking a look at this, write 9/15ths as a percent. We are taking and we're scaling it down because we know 5, if we divide 15 by 3 to get 5, we know 5 can get to 100. So if we scale it down to a number we can use to get to 100, that will help us find the percent using an original denominator that would not go to 100 easily. So 15 divided by 3 is 5, 9 divided by 3 is 3. So we have 3/5, which is an equivalent ratio of 9/15ths. We know that we can take the 3/5 and we can multiply the 5 by 20 to get 100. When we do that, then we're able to multiply 3 by 20 to get 60. So we can say finding the equivalent ratio with 100 as a denominator will help us find the percent. So in this case, we can say 9/15ths is equal to 60% because the 60 is the numerator of this fraction, which is equivalent to 9/15ths and equivalent to 3/5. Talk about it. On the side of page 95, there are 2 questions. The first one is, a classmate claims that you can always write a fraction as a decimal by dividing the numerator by the denominator. Is this a valid method? Why or why not? So they're saying you can always take the numerator, 9/15ths. We'll use that as an example. We can always take the numerator and divide it by the denominator, and this would give us the fraction. So we could say, or we give us the decimal. 9 divided by 15. Does that give us a decimal? And in this case, if we're using the calculator, we can say 9 divided by 15 would give us 0.6. And we could put the 0 at the end to make 60%. Is this a valid way to work and find the decimal if we have this ratio or this fraction or any other fractions? Yes, it is valid. You can do that. It's a really easy way, especially if you're using a calculator. Talk about it. A classmate wrote the decimal form 9/15 as 0.6. Another classmate wrote the decimal form as 0.06. Who is correct and why? So kind of going by what we had in the talk about it right beforehand. So 9/15, one person wrote this, one person wrote this. Are they correct? Who is correct? Are they both correct? They are both correct. Why are they both correct? Well, you have to think about this. 6/10 would be written as a fraction this way. 60/100 would be written as a fraction this way. And we know that 6/10 is the same as 60/100. And one way we can think about that is we can take 60/100 and we can get rid of one zero and another zero, and we would have the same thing as 6/10. Continuing on to page 96, top of page 96. Example 2, write fractions as percents and decimals. Write the fraction 6/8 as a percent and as a decimal. So this is the best way that you can find out to do this. Find an equivalent ratio with a denominator of 100. So just like on the previous page, you can take and find an equivalent ratio with 100 as a denominator. There is no whole number by which you can multiply 8 to get to 100. So first simplify this fraction. So we're going to take 6/8 and we're going to simplify it to 3/4. And these are equivalent fractions or equivalent ratios. We can use both. And because we know that fourths are easy to get to 100, we can take 3/4, multiply the 4 by 25 to get 100, multiply the 3 by 25 to get 75. So we can say that 6/8 is the same as 75%. Part B, write 6/8 as a decimal. So as a percent, 6/8 equals 75%. Write 75% as a decimal. So 75% we would say would equal 0.75 or 75 hundredths. So as a percent, 6/8 is 75%. As a decimal, 0.75 would be the answer. Check. Write 4/16 as a percent and as a decimal. So I'm going to use 4/16. I know I cannot get 16ths into 100 easily, so I am going to go ahead and simplify 16 by dividing it by 4. So 16 divided by 4 is 4. I will do the same thing to the numerator. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So I have 1/4 now. I know I can get the 4 to 100 easily. 4 times 25, just like what we had in the previous question up above. 4 times 25 equals 100. 1 times 25 equals 25. So write 4/16 as a percent. We have 25 over 100. And if we're taking a look at 25 over 100, I can create a percent using the numerator if it's over 100. Now, creating a decimal from 4/16, we're going to use the same procedure that we did right up here. So if I have 25%, I know that 4/16 equals 25%. What I can do is I can say 0.25, or I can look here at the fraction and say 25 hundredths. Having this second number in the hundredths place, I would have 25 hundredths as the decimal. Continuing on page